Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's talk, Budget Days. We should have made sure we had a plural in the title, 2021, Deficits and Their Impact on Western Canada. My name's Jim Farney. I'm the director of the Regina campus at JSGS, and I'll be moderating things today for a really exciting panel that I'll introduce in a second when I'm done the logistics side of the intro. JSGS, of course, is a provincial center for study in public policy, and we're proud to be a partnership between the universities of Saskatchewan and Regina, and to be really focused on engaging with both the public and the public service. And today, I think, is a good example of that. Physically, we're in Regina and Saskatoon, but virtually, we've got students across the world now, and I know people are joining us from all over the country. So while our physical home is on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6, I think it's worth recognizing that we're all on treaty, or in some cases unceded land this morning. To help the event run smoothly, I'd ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off your video during the remarks, and then turn things back on during the Q&A. This morning's format, I think, is fairly straightforward. Each speaker will speak for about 6 minutes, give or take. If they take too much, I'll cut them off, but we won't have to worry about that. And then we'll engage in a guided Q&A. So I'll ask you to send questions, or the beauty of this format is you don't have to disguise comments or challenges as questions. You can just send them to me in the chat function in their raw state, and I will grab the interesting ones or the challenging ones and try to direct them towards the panelists. I'll kind of take them more or less in the order that they come, but I will try to grab questions from students if I can track those down. So questions, comments, etc. to me, please, in the chat. Any logistical questions or technical questions to Karen Jaster-LaForge by chat as well. We are recording this so that we can broadcast it at a later date. And that's all of the logistics. Thank you, virtual world. By way of introduction of our 4 exciting speakers, in the order that they'll be speaking to us, Claire Eisman is an executive in residence with the school. She served as a deputy minister in the government of Saskatchewan in a variety of roles for 16 years, including deputy minister of finance from 2012 to 2017. She retired in 2020 and then joined us. She's a bachelor in commerce from the University of Saskatchewan, is an accountant by training and trade, and a charter director. She was awarded the Lieutenant Governor's Gold Medal for Public Admin in 2015, the CMA Member Recognition Award in 2010, named a Saskatchewan Woman of Influence in 2006, and received the Centennial Medal in 2005. Ron Stiles is also an executive in residence with the school. He did his degrees at the U of R with a kind of master's in economics and a specialty in public finance. He served the government of Saskatchewan for 35 years on both the Crown and the government side, and was most recently president of SaskTel. He's also been president of the Crown Investments Corp, deputy minister of finance, of highways, president of Sask Housing and Sask Water. So he knows Saskatchewan government reasonably well. He's overseen a number of pretty significant restructuring initiatives, including to the corporate tax restructuring system and to the federal provincial housing arrangement. He also continues to work as a consultant and an advisor, including to the University of Regina. So I hope he's keeping us out of trouble on the GR side, even as he's speaking to us. Dr. Jennifer Winter joins us from the University of Calgary, where she's an associate professor in the Department of Economics and the scientific director of the Energy and Policy Unit in the School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on climate policies and examines the consequences and trade-offs of government regulation and policy on energy development. She's testified at the Senate of Canada on emission pricing policies and advised governments of Alberta and of Canada. She's also actively engaged in increasing public understanding of energy and environmental policy issues, and serves on several boards and advisory committees. Last but definitely not least is Paul Booth, faculty director of the Ivy School's Senior Public Leaders Program at Western. He retired as director, as professor at the Ivy School in 2016, which the same year he was appointed the member of the Order of Canada. In addition to his university work, he's served as a consultant to a variety of Canadian and international organizations and as a senior public service in both provincial and federal governments. In Saskatchewan, he was our Deputy of Finance and Secretary to Treasury Board. At the federal level, he was Associate Deputy Minister of Finance and G7 Deputy, Senior Associate Deputy Minister of Industry, and most recently, Deputy Minister of the Environment. And he retired from the public service in July 2012. And I'm getting a note that I should increase my volume. So if you didn't hear the wonderful credentials of everybody, my apologies. We'll try to make sure that you can definitely hear what they're trying to say. So we'll go through, I'll ask them to each kind of give their 6-minute takes on both budgets, because it's a nice bit of timing this year that they're close enough together we can talk about provincial and federal together. And also, frankly, nice that we've got a federal one to talk about. So we'll work through in the order I introduced them, Claire, Ron, Jennifer, and Paul, and then we'll turn it over to the Q&A. Thank you all.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. It's a very distinguished panel, and I'm very honored and humbled to be a part of it. After listening to and kind of starting to review Monday's federal budget, and then starting to prepare for this morning, I almost felt like my 2-year-old grandson. Whenever I ask him a question, his immediate response is, and I can't help but think he's trying to drill down into that 2 years worth of life experience to figure out what the answer to my question actually is. And after seeing over 700 pages and a budgeted deficit of almost $155 billion, my first reaction was exactly the same. It was, what can I actually make of this? And what do I think about it? I guess on one hand, $155 billion of deficit is better than the $355 billion that we're seeing this year. And who could have ever anticipated that we'd be in the situation that we are? But these numbers are so big that I truly wonder whether or not we can actually appreciate the magnitude of the situation, the circumstances, and what the future actually will hold. And I think I'm also worried about whether or not we as Canadians from much of the country no longer really think that deficits and debt really matters. And I have to say that that is of concern on both sides of this. But having said that, I personally think that if there was a time for operational deficits, it's now. But the challenge with deficit spending, in my experience, is that there's a risk of being addicted to it in terms of the programs and services that we expect from the multiple levels of government. And as a result, it's very, very difficult to stop. I was reflecting back to a conversation I had with then Premier Wall once, comparing deficits to eating potato chips, which I think, given these numbers, that's a pretty mild analogy, but I'm sure you basically get the point. So let me reflect a little bit on the Saskatchewan budget and the federal budget that we've seen now over the last couple of weeks. Saskatchewan's budget theme is protect, build, and grow. And the federal budget this week came out saying a recovery plan for jobs, growth, and resilience. So when I look at it at a high level, the objectives of these two budgets are actually pretty similar. And the context is also pretty similar from my perspective. Troubled times, uncertainty, a low cost of borrowing, a need for stimulus, and a willingness to borrow, and even perhaps, I would suggest, a need. What's the difference? Well, I think the difference is in the priorities, or at least how they're reflected and maybe how some people think they should be addressed. And I think the regional circumstances and the needs are very different. And the federal government's ability to borrow is certainly different than the province's ability to borrow. And yet, what I see here is a significant risk of ongoing, some people would say downloading, in the medium to longer term, that I think, although it may not have an immediate impact right now on the Saskatchewan situation, I think it's going to have a very significant impact going forward. So how did they do? Well, I think I'm on the fence. I'm probably balancing on the fence, but still somewhat on the fence. When I think about the experience of trying to build a budget, part of the challenge is appreciating that it truly is an estimate. It's based on the best information and the best evidence that you have in front of you at any given point in time, and what the key objectives of the government in power is. But right now, the level of uncertainty in Saskatchewan and Canada and around the world is so high that I think preparing a budget at this point and delivering a budget is truly what I'll describe to be a shot in the dark. That might be, to some people, a bit of an overstatement, but I think given the reality of the world today, I don't think it is. The pandemic is obviously the most significant uncertainty that we face. Where's the economy going to land after all of this? Where's the quality of education going to land after all of this? I wonder whether or not we're actually going to get back to the needed immigration levels that we need in this country, unless the whole world can actually get a handle on the pandemic. Climate change and the green economy are important, but I guess my question is, can we actually get to a level of agreement and understanding about what this means and how we're going to get there? Or are we going to continue to live in a world where we're kind of just, to some degree, once again, shooting in the dark to figure out what the priorities are, and it's going to be a bit of a hit and miss scenario? All of that, I think, lends this level of uncertainty and sometimes contradiction to the budget process. Going forward, if everything happens based on what the health practitioners and the economists are telling us, then okay, I think these budgets are pretty reasonable if we can actually see increased investment throughout the economy, if we can see sufficient flexibility for the different needs and priorities across the country to be addressed, and can we see strengthened federal, provincial, and territorial relations in order to maximize successful outcome. And I think this continues to be one of the significant challenges in any budget program. Like most things, though, I do think it's doable if there's a will to do it. But there's one thing based on my review to date that I think is still missing, and that's a commitment to some set of parameters or goalposts that are linked to the budget. There are some of these parameters in both of the budgets. For example, there's agreement there that we need to deal with the pandemic and its impacts, mostly in the short term. That's where the measures are. We need to stay flexible in case outcomes are different than planned. So I think both budgets speak to the fact that that level of uncertainty is there and that there is risk. And clearly we need to really understand the impacts of the pandemic at an individual level, on a regional basis, a national, as well as a global impact. But dealing with the immediate issues of the pandemic is only one aspect of what I think government needs to really think about. I think there's going to be a need to be time and effort spent on the analysis of what we've learned from the pandemic and what investments will be needed to address them on a go-forward basis. And I'm not sure that I saw plans for that adequately addressed in my somewhat cursory review of the federal budget. Spending to support growth and recovery seems to be well accepted, but how much and for how long feels very uncertain to me, and I don't think the plans are very adequate there. This is where that clarity, I think, isn't sufficient. How long can we sustain these deficits? How much borrowing for ongoing operations is too much? And I think those questions have been left unanswered. I personally would like to see more clear parameters on ratios like deficit as a percentage of GDP and accumulated deficit to GDP, for example. These are important sustainability measures. I think the federal budget does go farther in terms of setting those parameters than the Saskatchewan budget does, and hopefully we'll start to see that going forward. Lastly, The 700 plus pages in the federal budget is so much and so complex that I'm not sure anyone knows how it will be implemented, and that will continue to be an issue. Allocating dollars without a sound plan, timelines, and partnerships won't lead to the effective outcomes that the government is talking about. And this is where governments can easily get caught in that bureaucracy of planning and just making commitments. But both budgets have outlined priorities. Now I think it's up to businesses, investors, stakeholders, educational institutions, researchers, and sectors to fulfill their obligation to sift through what's available and to utilize the dollars. And the one thing I think my experience has taught me is that governments can set the framework, they can put a budget in place, but it's really up to everyone else to utilize those dollars to effectively achieve the outcomes and those more global commitments that have been achieved. That's one way that I think as citizens, we can hold the government, whether it's the provincial or the federal government, accountable to truly make the investments that they've said they're prepared to make and to actually see the outcomes that they've outlined. Thanks very much. Over to you, Ron.
Thanks very much, Claire. As everybody knows, we're in a very unique period of time right now. We've had a year of lockdowns. There's been a lot of stress, a lot of change in our economy, a lot of change for us from a cultural perspective. These types of impacts are obviously going to have long-term impacts when it comes to the economy, when it comes to politics, when it comes to culture. I mean, just all aspects of our society. These type of impacts usually manifest themselves in government budgets in some way, shape, or form. And I think these two budgets are probably an illustration of the fact that some of that change is starting to manifest itself in the provincial and the federal budgets. I first want to start with where we are in the pandemic, because I think that's an important aspect of the environment that we're entering into. And maybe first and foremost, okay, we haven't been through the rebound yet. And both levels of government are really trying to take that into account. They're trying to look at what's necessary to get the government back, or pardon me, the economy back to something approaching normal. And the table that you got here in front of you, okay, shows April versus December for a number of different industrial sectors, okay? And even as of December, some of the sectors are getting back close to normal, but that doesn't even take into account the lost growth, okay, from 2020. Or what might happen in 2021. For some of the sectors, accommodation, food services, and air transportation, again, they're a long ways from a recovery. And that is one of, obviously, the objectives, I think, for both budgets, to somehow try to deal with that recovery, stimulate things a little bit to get us back to something close to maybe full employment. You can see that in 2020, GDP dropped 5.4%. In 2021, they're looking for a major rebound of 5.8%, 4% in 2022. So there's some sense, at least at the federal level, okay, we're going to recover quickly. We'll have to see what happens. The second part, if you have a look at the two budgets and do a little bit of a comparison between them, there is some pretty substantial differences. And I don't mean just in the size, obviously, of the two budgets, okay, but in a sense, almost the optimism that is being put on the table. So if you look at the province, they're thinking that the Canadian economy is going to recover by 3.4%. The federal budget is saying by 5.8%. Those are quite different versions of what the rebound looks like. And that's going to have a major impact for taxation. It's going to have a major impact, I think, in terms of what the government can successfully achieve in the coming fiscal year. Secondly, you look at deficits, okay? Federal deficit is, again, very, very large at $154 billion. It's not going to be the largest, and it's not even close to being as large as it was in 2020, 2021. But if you look at the provincial deficit, this will be the largest deficit the province has ever run, because last year, it's only going to be $1.7 billion. Now, if you look at them on a per capita basis, the federal deficit is still substantially larger than the province, okay? But again, the timing of events and activities is a little different between the two budgets. If you look at debt to GDP ratios in 2021 and 2025, okay? Federal government is telling us that they're going to sort of cap themselves off at around that 50%, okay, and try to hold a plateau. Whereas the province of Saskatchewan's talking about debt to GDP continuing to climb. Again, it's a little different picture about the long term. It has something different to say about exactly what each government intends to do over the next number of years. And I think to some extent, getting back to normal you need to almost understand what those governments believe normal is going to look at. And again, the two budgets, I think, say some things quite differently. Now, I called my comments a chicken in every pot, okay? Because when you look at the federal budget, and as Claire said, a massive document, 740 some pages, a lot of legislation, a lot of money. But if you look at the focus of what they're trying to do, there's sort of three major areas: a national child care program, pandemic recovery, and climate change. But if you go beyond that, I mean, everything is a priority in this budget. It's absolutely amazing. From a communications perspective, the people that are trying to communicate this, I feel sorry for them. You usually need 1, 2, or 3 sort of themes, and you're going to ride those themes. Yet in this budget, there is something for everybody, and they're trying to accomplish everything essentially at once. And again, it's an election budget. Maybe that's what we should have expected, but I think there's a little bit more to it than just calling it an election budget. On the flip side, if you look at the provincial budget, it's relatively well focused. It does talk about trying to recover from the pandemic. It's trying to talk about restarting the economy. But one of the things that sort of is notable from my perspective is I think maybe the provincial budget is in better shape than what that $2.6 billion deficit seems to indicate. And I want to note a number of different things that sort of leads me to that conclusion. And first off, there's a $350 million one-time set of payments from the auto fund. Again, this is one time. It's not going to be there next year. It's not part of a structural problem that the government is going to have to deal with. I'd also note that the provincial assumption around oil, and again, oil is very important to our revenue stream, is quite a bit lower in a sense, okay, than what the federal assumption is. Now, I'm not sure if that means the federal government's correct or the province is correct, okay? But that differential, says something about maybe the conservatism that's built into that, into our particular budget here in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of one-time COVID expenditures. Again, I think it's important to understand $1.5 billion for the province. Again, I don't believe that COVID is going to simply be gone next budget year, but obviously, it's going to take a lot less in terms of resources, devoted resources to deal with it. I think, assuming we can get to a herd mentality or a herd vaccination situation. In addition, when you look at the level of the rebound or the amount of the rebound, the federal government's talking 5.8, the province 3.7. The province's projection, okay, about the Canadian rebound is reflected in the Saskatchewan GDP forecast they have. It is lower than any of the private sector forecasters that are out there. 3.7 versus 4.6. So again, it looks to me like there's probably some room in there for revenues to grow beyond what they're forecasting. This may reduce the deficit in a pretty significant way. The province as well has not incorporated some of the increased federal transfers that were put out in the federal budget. And again, some of those transfers are going to land as sort of a new stream of revenue that's going to help us get our overall deficit under control. So one of the conclusions I think I arrive at when I look at the provincial budget is that definitely, it's probably in better shape. It's a very conservative budget. I don't anticipate that when things are said and done at the end of 21-22, it's going to be a $2.6 billion deficit. I think it'll be something dramatically less. And in fact, I think they're probably positioning to get themselves into an actual balanced position probably in the next 3 or 4 years. They're projecting 5 years. I tend to think that they're in a much better shape than really they're stating in the budget right now. Finally, there's 4 or 5 things that I would encourage people to pay attention to over the next period of time. Things that I think are indicative of changes that are occurring right now in the Canadian political landscape. And one of them, okay, there seems to be a real shift, okay, to greater intervention in the economy. Over the past 25 or 30 years, what you've seen is a push to lower taxes. Get our meters under control when it comes to our comparative numbers versus the United States and other countries around the world. About pulling back from sort of those large major program initiatives that, like Medicare in the past. You haven't seen too many things like that. And all of a sudden we've got a childcare initiative that is that sort of national new policy, new program initiative that we haven't seen for a very long time. We're not seeing so much of that at the provincial level, but you're actually seeing more intervention at the provincial level than might have been the case 4 or 5 years ago. And it might just be the pandemic. But I think there's a good chance you're going to see more intervention actually by provinces such as Saskatchewan going forward. I think it's becoming what the public are demanding. They want to be protected against a lack of vaccines. They want to be protected, through the healthcare system. They just want more, and I think government's going to have to respond to it. Claire's observation about fiscal discipline be the same one that I have as well. To me, fiscal discipline may be a thing of the past, and it was for 10 or 15 years as well. If you go back into the 80s and 90s, and it just looks to me like maybe it is going to go the way of the dodo bird again. The best situation you can find in either document is that the provincial surpluses won't return for about 10 years, and that's from the point of the last one. And for the federal government, it doesn't look like any hope of a surplus anytime soon. They're not projecting one at this point in time, and in fact, they won't even make a statement about where they think they're going to land over the next, say, 7 or 8 years. The other part of this, I think, to pay real close attention to is the depth of the economic rebound in 2021. Obviously, we're into a very significant and serious fourth wave in the pandemic. Whether there's a fifth wave after that, I don't think anybody really knows. Hopefully, it wouldn't be as significant or severe, but it doesn't look any longer like the fall is going to be returned to normal, whatever that is going to be. It now looks like that return to normal is probably early into 2022. And I think that may have some economic consequences for us as well. Finally, I find that some of the variables that we've taken for granted that seem to always be under control for the last, 10 or 15 years, inflation and interest rates being two of them, I'm beginning to question whether or not those are going to maybe go in a little different direction. We've already returned, this morning Bank of Canada already advised that we've returned to a 2.2% inflation rate. I tend to think you're going to see higher inflation this year. That might mean a return to higher interest rates faster than anybody is expecting. And the other one of these variables that is starting to give me some concern is the foreign exchange rate with the US. This morning we peaked at 80 cents, and if you think just a year ago we were at about 71, that is a significant change in the foreign exchange rates with our largest trading partner. Could have pretty significant impacts, I think, for our economy over the next number of years. With that, I'm going to stop there, and Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you, okay, to take over and guide us forward.
Thanks, and it's great to be here. I'm going to focus my remarks on the climate and energy policy provisions in both the federal and Saskatchewan budget. And what I think is particularly interesting is that there's an entire chapter in the federal budget devoted to climate policy. And if you compare that to the Saskatchewan budget, there's, I think, one mention of the word climate, 2 occurrences of emissions, and slightly more on sort of the energy side. So just by default, I have to talk a little bit more about the federal budget because there's just more content there. That said, and I think it's been alluded to by both Claire and Ron, the federal budget has tons and tons of stuff. I mean, it's 724 pages. And it's, to me as a climate policy scholar, it's exciting that there is a chapter devoted to climate policy in the federal budget, but it's only about, I think, 35 of those 700 plus pages. And so that's about 5% of the page space in the federal budget. So exciting that there is a chapter, but it's really not actually that much content in the grand scheme of things of the budget itself. I want to highlight a few interesting things that I noticed in the federal budget's climate chapter. And there is also a lot of stuff. There's a lot of content. Almost every page has 2 or 3 initiatives that the federal government is supporting. What I think is particularly interesting is that the actions in the budget combined with previous announcements make it look like, or that the plan is that Canada will exceed its 2030 emissions targets. So the target is a 30% reduction in emissions relative to 2005 levels. The budget suggests it'll be a 36% reduction. And I have to think that that is very strategic, given that everyone is expecting President Biden to announce very aggressive 2030 and 2050 targets. The second thing that's particularly interesting in the federal budget is a big emphasis on research and development and tax breaks for zero emissions manufacturing and other types of technologies, including specific provisions for carbon capture use and storage, which I think will be particularly interesting in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. So a big focus on government support, both in direct cash, tax breaks, and research and development through different government agencies. And then the third thing that I find interesting, and this is a little bit wonkish, but it's the fact that for backstop provinces that have the federal carbon tax in place, the climate action incentive rebate is moving from yearly with income taxes to quarterly through some other mechanism. So potentially a way to make the climate action incentive rebate more salient to voters in those provinces. And then I think I want to conclude with just mentioning that the similarity between the Saskatchewan budget and the federal budget is, again, a focus on innovation and emissions reduction technologies, particularly in heavy industry. So despite the fact that there isn't a whole lot in the Saskatchewan budget, it's very similar, focused on incentives for emissions reduction in heavy industry. And so we see that in the federal budget as well. And my last remark is, it will be really interesting to see all of these initiatives actually roll out if the Liberals are reelected. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I am one of 3 former finance deputy ministers on this panel. And so you have to kind of pick your spots. And what I'm going to do is focus on the macroeconomics of the federal budget, because both Claire and Ron are much closer to the Saskatchewan budget than I am, and Jennifer knows a lot more about the environmental initiatives than I do. So I think that's where I'm going to try to add something. When you're the finance deputy, you really have 2 roles at budget time. One is helping your minister and the government craft a budget that puts the government's direction into action and also attracts the support of the legislature or parliament and ultimately voters. And that's especially important for minority governments. Secondly, as the government's senior financial official, you have to provide advice on how the fiscal plan of the government will affect both the public finances, and Ron and Claire both talked about that, and the economy more broadly. So I think it's worth starting when we think about the federal budget to remember that the budget stance is really dictated by the political requirements of what is getting to be a fairly long in the tooth minority government. This government has lasted longer than minority governments often do. And of course, in a very special circumstance now in the midst of the 3rd wave of the pandemic. So really, people talk about, is this an election budget or not? All budgets are related to elections. There's no doubt about that. But I think the key priority for this budget is to maintain the support of the new Democrats in Parliament, at least until the fall, when we may have another election window if we have a lot of success with vaccination, or though, as Ron said, only time will tell. And of course, to provide a basis for a fall election platform if that is what's required. So what are the key macro elements? Well, what we see in this plan is large permanent increases in mostly social spending, not entirely social spending, but mostly. no new revenue items of any consequence, and large increases in borrowing over the next 5 years. And in fact, the borrowing over the next 5 years will almost be equal to the borrowing that we did during the pandemic year. We also see that debt service costs are going to rise to almost 10% of revenue, which is actually what former central bank governor David Dodge had recommended, although that's based on assuming very low interest rates continue. And what appears to be a permanent rise in one of the ratios that Claire mentioned, and that is the debt to GDP ratio. So, you know, when the government was first elected in 2015, they said they were going to balance the budget in a couple of years. Then they moved to a 30% debt to GDP ratio, and now they've moved again to a 50% debt to GDP ratio. So there's no sense that, you know, we are going to pay back or retire the debt that we incurred as a result of the pandemic. Now, I mentioned assumptions. What should we say about assumptions? First of all, as Ron said, the federal government's assuming pretty robust economic growth, getting us back to where we were in 2019 by early 2022, and then actually assuming that the measures that they're taking are going to speed the long-term growth of the economy, maybe by 0.2%, which is not trivial. And of course, sustained low interest rates, that's a very important assumption given the borrowing that we've done and we're planning to do. And also, you know, as in all budgets, no further shocks to the economy in general or energy prices over the next 5 years. And you can't really be critical about that assumption because shocks by their nature are very, very difficult to predict. The headline promise is the National Child Care Program. Ron mentioned that. $8 billion annual cost at maturity. Interesting to me, all borrowed. This is a great idea, but not an idea that's important enough that will raise the money to pay for it. It's also going to be matched by provinces, or that's the federal government's hope. And there are some questions. I mean, Ron mentioned this, but certainly for provinces in Atlantic Canada or even Ontario for that matter, whether they have the fiscal capacity to actually match those funds. So, you know, that's a key promise, but it's largely unfunded. And I think that we have to keep that in mind, and also the fact that this is a minority government. So, you know, in sum, what does this say about the fiscal integrity of the public finances? Well, to put this in perspective, because debt to GDP numbers or hundreds of billions of dollars of borrowing, pretty hard to get your mind around that. Basically, the federal government borrowed about $37,000 per family of four over the past year to deal with the pandemic. So, you know, very expensive response, reflecting the very difficult circumstances that we were in. In the budget, they are proposing to borrow about another $35,000 per family of four over the next 5 years. And that's what really will keep the debt to GDP ratio, even though GDP is proposed to grow quite quickly, to keep it up at the 50% range. And of course, the other key issue for the government is the low interest rate assumption. Because even though they're assuming interest rates will rise over time, they're rising very modestly. And with with interest rates so low right now, if we get a significant rise in interest rates, debt service costs will explode, and that will put the government's budget at peril. So, you know, there are some serious questions, I think, that both Claire and Ron raised about the fiscal integrity of the federal budget. And I think that we'll have to see how the economy unfolds, not just the domestic economy, but the global economy, to see how this will all turn out over the next 5 years. So Jim, I'll turn it back to you to start the next part of the proceedings.
Thank you all. You covered a lot of waterfront there, and I'm also happy to see questions coming in quite quickly in the chat. So keep them coming in, please. I'm going to ask a version of a question that Brady asked, which is about the focus on youth in the federal budget, and whether or not that kind of meets the needs. But I wonder if there's actually a broader question there about the place of developmental policy in budget making. So we saw that massive investment in childcare, and in the provincial budget, while it's a bit inflated by federal transfers and COVID spending, education spending stayed higher than I expected it to do. So do these two budgets taken together kind of represent an investment in youth, or is it kind of just an attempt to offset COVID numbers? And I'm honestly not sure who to send it to, other than I don't think this is Jennifer's bailiwick. So I'll ask one of the former deputies to stick their toes into those waters.
You know, maybe I'll kick it off, Jim. I'm not sure you can draw a specific conclusion based on this budget right now. You know, it's held things constant essentially for the education system. They have pumped in Saskatchewan. They have pumped more into the K-12 system to a large extent. And so I don't think you can conclusively say it today. The federal government really hasn't done much when it comes to education. I mean, they've done some things for students to try to help students, but that's really a reaction to the fact that students are having trouble accessing jobs right now. And they're trying to make sure that student loans and all the rest of that stays afloat. So I think what will be interesting to see is what happens in the next 2 or 3 years, and whether or not, you know, there is some new money for post-secondary for the colleges, more money to try to, you know, grow our educational sector. I think the sector is actually going to be facing some pretty significant problems. Claire pointed it out. It doesn't look like immigration is going to return to the levels that I think the federal government would like. They're doing some things to try to pad the numbers in a sense. 90,000 students, okay, or temporary visa applicants that are here in Canada. They're going to try to, you know, make them permanent, and that's great. But again, are they going to get to 400,000 a year? I highly doubt it. I think that's, you know, you're a couple of years off from that. And that's going to have a major impact for universities that depend on foreign students. So I still think it's too early to say, you know, where education is going to land in all of this. One of the concerns I would have is that there's going to be a crowding out effect here. You can't do everything. I mean, economics is all about the allocation of scarce resources, and eventually you have to come back to that and decide what you're going to do. So that would be my initial thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't mind chiming in on this one too. And I agree with Ron. I don't think we can tell yet, but education was the one area that I was really thinking about when I thought, what have we learned from the pandemic and what are we going to do about it? And this is where I worry a little bit about, there's so much money there and so many things for so many people. Education for me is going to be one of these critical areas. Thinking about kids in the primary school system and even into the high school system, what they potentially lost over the potential 18 months of the pandemic, if you think that we're kind of stuck in this until the end of this calendar year. How do we make that up? What plans are going to be put in place to address them, and what's the cost of that going to be? The need for changed ways of learning so that we can address these kinds of things going forward. And all of that will take time and resources to do it. And I do worry a little bit about, is there going to be sufficient money left to actually address some of those challenges? And on the innovation front, it's going to need it as well. So once again, I think the particularly the federal budget is so broad-based that I worry that it's crowded out a whole lot of things about where these needs are going to be as a result of coming out of the pandemic.
So this might be another too early to tell question, but it's a question I will be able to throw at Jennifer. So I'll do it that way. And Paul too, he has a lot of expertise in this area. And that is the mention in the federal budget of border carbon adjustments. How complicated a creature is this, and how fast is the international discussion moving around kind of coordinated carbon tax? My anecdotal evidence is the Financial Times suddenly has a climate section, which seems to me that they're taking it seriously. So what that study call for Canada, and how likely are we to see substantial change around border carbon adjustments?
Yeah, so that's another really interesting provision that I neglected to mention. My take on it is that Europe has been exploring this for quite some time, and I think that has that's prompted Canada's interest. Second, it really looks like a carbon tax is not going to go forward in the United States, and there are competitiveness concerns in Canada. And so we already have both provincial and federal approaches to manage that through output-based pricing. But a border carbon adjustment is the other approach that Canada could take. And if it looks like other countries are moving in that direction, then I think it does make sense for Canada to explore that policy tool as well. How long it'll take, who knows? Like everyone said, there's just a ton of stuff in this budget, and what is going to take priority is, even within the climate chapter, is going to I think it who knows what is actually the priority.
It depends on what happens with our trading partners, especially the US, and that's going to be very important. But I guess the other point that I would raise, and I think both Ron and Claire could appreciate this, because finance deputies in Saskatchewan are also tax collectors, and technically very demanding to work your way through a border carbon adjustment. It's not a trivial tax to collect. There are lots of requirements in order to get it right, and lots of room for potential taxpayers to complain or litigate you. And so I think that as long as the US doesn't go forward with this, it's unlikely that we would in the short run or by ourselves. But if they do, then we'll be looking very carefully at what they decide to do on this front.
Cool. So I'm going to pull together kind of two lines of questioning on childcare here, and they're both related to the Fed Prov angle. But one is about whether we have clarity that this is actually a formal shared cost program, kind of the classic 50 cents on the dollar, or if it's something more amorphous, that the feds are just hoping to increase their spending to the point that it's 50-50 without tight strings attached. And the other one is a bit more nebulous, but if we could speculate what those federal provincial tables might look like. There's already a fair bit of provincial variation in childcare spending across the country. Do we have a read on how quickly and how smoothly those types of negotiations are likely to go? And I think, Ron, we had decided was the sacrificial victim on all Fed Prov questions in the initial going. So I'll throw it his way first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll offer some observations. I really think the childcare program that they've come out with is all about politics. I'm not sure that, it's really the underlying desire to have a national program that's at work here. And I say that for a variety of reasons. I mean, number one is this really fits the Quebec situation, okay, and what Quebec has done when it comes to childcare. And so, obviously it's going to be very positive, I think, for the federal government in the context of that particular part of their constituency. When you talk about Western Canada and the financial challenges that we have out here with Alberta and Saskatchewan right now, I mean, we're heavily into deficit as well as BC. More conservative governments, they want to probably try to be a little bit more fiscally prudent. This is going to put them squarely in the crosshairs. And so, you're going to have a fair number of the constituents, okay, in those provinces coming after government for more money when the government doesn't want to do that. And when that particular constituency really doesn't support the existing governments that are in place. So I think this is a lot more right now about politics. From a federal provincial perspective, I think it's going to really create a lot more concerns. The provinces have every right to be uncomfortable with this type of a national program, because once it's established, the provinces are left to deliver it, to meet new demands, where the federal government, okay, always goes back to, here's what we agreed to do, and that's all we're going to do. You see that in healthcare today. And so I think provinces are going to be very nervous about this. So I think you're going to see a lot of conflict at the federal provincial table. I'm not sure you're going to see very many provinces sort of jump onto the childcare bandwagon and talk about national programs and national standards, et cetera. I think they're going to try to look for something a little different that gives them more room, more flexibility, and maybe something that's maybe more unconditional. I wouldn't be surprised to see the discussion go in that direction. So those are my initial thoughts on it. It's definitely going to create some pretty interesting discussions, I think, the next time the premiers and the prime minister get together.
Any other thoughts on that? I mean, the discussion that I've seen has been, I think, quite a bit more optimistic and kind of general commentary that this is, as the finance minister sold it, a once in a generation adjustment to our welfare state.
Well, I mean, this promise has been around for a long time, right? It has a long history. The finance minister said that it was a once in a generation initiative. At the same time, she didn't provide any specific revenue source to finance it. And, she throws half of the funding responsibility to provinces, who are in, much more difficult financial circumstances than the federal government. And as Ron said, I mean, provinces have good reason to be wary. I mean, when Medicare was originally proposed by the federal government, it was supposed to be a 50-50 shared cost program. And we know that it didn't turn out that way. I mean, the one thing that we should say, though, is that one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that one place where our economy is not resilient is when we get locked down like this. It has a big impact on families, and especially labor force participation by moms. And, if we're going to be resilient to these kinds of shocks to our economy, we need to do something about that. So I guess my feeling is that this is a very important issue, both for social policy, but also for economic policy. But I don't have a lot of confidence yet that the federal government is really serious about it. And maybe it's too much to ask a minority government to be able to really do something concrete about it.
Jim, one of the things that Paul's mentioned twice that I think is very important and is really lost in the budgets, the federal budget especially right now, is the fact that there's no revenue sources, okay, for these new initiatives. And I think, behind that comment, for me at least, okay, it raises the question, where's the revenue going to come from? What kind of new taxes are we going to be faced? I don't know if it's in 2022, 2023. And, you hear these trial balloons coming out about a change to the capital gains tax system here in Canada. I've heard people talk sort of wistfully about whether or not you're talking about wealth taxes of some sort, estate taxes of some sort, but you can't continue to fund things at the level you're funding it and maybe increase it in the future if you don't find some new revenue sources. And I think that's a debate that's coming, again, may not be this year, but I sure think it's coming maybe next year or the following year, and maybe at the provincial level as well, because the province is going to have to restrict expenditures if it's going to stay away from new taxes.
I want to stray outside my lane and comment on this, because I think maybe the Alberta perspective is helpful. Alberta's fiscal situation is a deliberate political choice. We're a province without a provincial sales tax. We have very low personal income taxes, and instead, governments for years, for decades, have been relying on resource royalty revenue to fund spending and on social programs like healthcare and education. So, that's a deliberate political choice, and it's a hard choice, but there are sources of revenue. And the last government in Alberta, they piloted $25 a day daycare. That was very popular, and it was canceled by the UCP. And these conservative governments, they're partly because of the pandemic, but their popularity is really low right now. Their approval ratings are really low, and I think it would be really hard in Alberta's next provincial election for either Jason Kenney or Rachel Notley to say, no, we don't think it's valuable to invest in affordable childcare for Alberta families. I think that is going to be an incredibly hard political statement to make.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jennifer. And I think, the points that people have made are exactly the right ones. I think history is the best predictor of the future. When you think about healthcare, when you think about equalization, when you think about the stability funds, job skills training, these have forever been a tension between the federal government and the provincial governments in terms of the autonomy of how you spend it and who's controlling what. And I think the federal government potentially has gone there. But I agree with what Paul said. I think it's the right policy. I'm just not sure that they've contemplated, number one, how to pay for it, but number two, what's the right bottom line of it too? And that goes to Jennifer's point. Is it $10? What's that magic number that's there that really does drive the outcomes that are there? And I think that's going to be a lot of the discussion and the debate around the table of how to potentially figure it out. But it goes back for me to the point about how are we going to pay for all of this? And because I think there's lots of other costs that haven't been addressed yet. So the pressure is going to be on.
And, just to underline what Jennifer and Claire have been saying, so the federal government is talking about $8 billion at maturity for this program. And that's to be matched by another presumably equivalent amount by the provinces when you take them all together. Well, that's about 2% percentage point increase in the HST. So, that's not inconceivable. It's not, we couldn't possibly do that. But I think this conversation would be a lot more concrete for an important program if someone, in power said, this is what we're proposing, this is what it will cost, and we will pay for it this way, for example, by increasing the HST by 2%. Well, I mean, then people could make choices, right? And I think, you know, this is a group of economists giving their views on these things, but and accountants, Claire. But I think that this, you know, this discussion would be, you know, a lot more real for people if we actually talked about the funding as well as the costs, or as well as the benefits that programs like this would give us.
So I feel the need to stand up for the disreputable politicians for a second. So I'm going to push a question back on Paul and Claire. I think it's entirely right to think of this as a political question, and being willing to put the idea of higher revenue or higher taxes on the table. But I'm also curious, you know, we've spent a generation and a half taking that stuff off the table, right? Lowering taxes and reducing expenditure. Have we created budgeting processes or ministries of finance where it's difficult to work that stuff up? I mean, I saw a couple of minor and frankly pretty goofy tax increases in the federal budget. We used to talk about guardians and spenders. Is there any place in the modern process at the federal or provincial level to say, you know, maybe it is time to raise the HST?
Well, I guess I can speak from my own personal experience. The last budget I worked on, which was, I mean, Saskatchewan was really starting to feel the pressures of the impact on non-renewable resource revenues. We were very reliant on them, too reliant. And I think that's where the professional public service needs to step up and provide options for governments. They need to really understand what the implications are. And, you know, the challenge is those implications are really hard. And I am completely sensitive to the difficulties of those choices that the elected people have to make. And I think to Jennifer's point, you know, how do you get there when you've got the electorate that is so divergent in terms of its point of view? But you get to a point where governments simply have to make the choice. And clearly, at the point in time that in Saskatchewan's case, the provincial sales tax was broadened significantly to include things that for many years weren't included in the base. But what you have now seen, and I think to Ron's earlier point, to set Saskatchewan up well, is a much more sustainable picture of where those revenue sources are coming from. And I think a more clear understanding by the electorate of why that was necessary. And I think that speaks to those important parameters that I talked about before is, you know, if government can get to the point about talking about those parameters and saying, this is where we believe the upper and the lower limits are, and we really want to work within them. And sometimes that's okay, but if it gets too high, we're going to bring it back. I think that's an important conversation that I would love to see the elected start to take with the people of the country so that everyone can better understand where this might take us. And then you don't get the shocks and the surprises, I think, you know, Jim, that you're referring to.
I guess the only thing that I would add is, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the important things that we need to do with our governments is to raise whatever revenue we need to fund public services, but to do it as efficiently as possible. And I don't think that you know, professional public servants and finance departments are shy about that. And also, in my experience, at a number of cabinet tables, when ministers say, oh, well, we'll find it in efficiency, or, I mean, it's not that there aren't things you can do to make both government spending and tax collection more efficient. You can, but they're not going to produce reliably the ongoing revenue that you need to fund a big new social program. So, you know, I mean, if you want to make it concrete to people, then you pick a tax that everyone understands and put it out there. And quite frankly, in my view, remember, I'm a senior citizen saying this, but one of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic is, the interaction between childcare and the economy. And so if there's ever a time to make a serious proposal, a funded proposal to do this, I can't think of a better time than now.
Neat. Okay, I'll be nicer to Ministry of Finance people going forward, I promise. Winter asked a question about the impact of CERB and probably the small business supports from the feds on provincial budgets. Do we have a sense of how much of the rosy picture that Saskatchewan's painting is a result of federal transfers to individuals, and whether this opens up the chance for kind of further federal spending like that?
Well, Jim, I mean, just to kick it off, I think the province and how it's fared fiscally, in fact, all the provinces, how they fared fiscally through the pandemic is owed in large part to the federal government and the amount of money that they've, pumped into the system. If the federal government hadn't stepped up, I think the provinces, including Saskatchewan, probably would have had to come out with more programs. Most of what happened in Saskatchewan was pretty targeted. It took very specific aspects of what was going in our economy. It found a program that dealt with that, but they weren't broad-based. They didn't extend across large parts of our population in this province, and I didn't see much of that in other jurisdictions as well. So, I think the provinces and their present fiscal situation, again, they probably need to thank the federal government, although you'll never hear that. More broadly, I think going forward, the provinces are going to have to really pay attention in the same manner to specific targeted areas of the economy and their population where there's going to need to be some support to get those aspects of the economy and of our population sort of back to where they were pre-pandemic. So I think you're going to see some of that in the coming year and a half. That's my sense of it anyways. The federal government sooner or later has to shut down CERB. I mean, it's the amount of money it's throwing out, and it's not very well targeted. It goes to everybody. It's a general stimulus. I understand that. But, when you look at it from the perspective of income and do people need it, obviously a lot of people didn't need it. I mean, they've just been salting it away, and you're talking about huge amounts of savings that, to some extent, the governments are hoping will all of a sudden be dumped back into the economy to stimulate economic activity. So, I mean, those are sort of my initial thoughts on it.
Jennifer, can we imagine a world in which this plays into the carbon tax debate, that people have kind of gotten used to direct transfers from the feds all of a sudden, and even as CERB runs down, get more comfortable with that as a political reality?
Potentially. I mean, I think it depends on what provinces we're talking about, right? In that, I think Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Ontario, there's political leaders that are using the federal carbon tax as a FedProv issue, right? And so there's a political narrative around the tax and the rebate that's quite different from what's in place in BC, right? Even though it's pretty much the same thing. There's a tax, and then there's a rebate from the revenue. I think what will potentially matter more for that is I think mainstreaming of climate policy discussion in political circles. So we have the federal Conservatives now saying that they're going to have a carbon tax that they're calling is not really a tax, even though it is, and that I think it takes some of the wind out of the sails of the premiers of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, in sort of opposition to that.
So I want to kind of throw up a question about long-term care to pull us in a different direction, and to be honest, one we hadn't talked much about when we kind of did pre-work for this. There is investment there in this federal budget. It flows through the provinces, it seems to me. I was surprised how limited it was, given the crisis we've seen in long-term care over the last year. And do we have a sense if this was a road less traveled, or was it simply that budgets need to have choices made, and we pick childcare over long-term care or big federal investments in healthcare?
Yeah, Jim, I think I agree with you. It's probably a bit of a surprise to me how limited it is, given the severity of the impacts, and I think probably what the needs are. There might be a couple of reasons for that. One is the potential level of uncertainty as to actually what the needs are going forward, and therefore how much actually needs to be spent. And, once again, going back to that federal provincial tension that's there, is that, there's currently health money there. And if it's a priority, use what's there, as opposed to this announcement for new, which I think is really underestimating what the problem is. But once again, it comes back down to the choices and that large volume. I think that slide that Ron put up that just said, there's a little bit for everybody here, and hopefully that's enough to kind of satisfy at least the starting off point. But I think it was underwhelming.
Jim, I think this is an issue that is still going to play out. The provinces have not given up on getting more money for health in each of their jurisdictions. Those discussions seem to still be ongoing, and I think the public is going to expect to see something a little different occur there. So I don't know if it's just an infusion of money, but I tend to suspect what the federal government is going to do is they're going to look at that infusion of money as a way to lever the provinces to do something different when it comes to long-term care. Now, exactly what that looks like, I'm not sure. It could be a push away from private companies running long-term care. It could be a push towards national standards, which every province in Canada detests. There's no province that likes national standards. Or it could be a push to simply upgrade, update, get the long-term care facilities that are out there into better shape. So, but there is still a shoe to drop here, and I suspect maybe it's a next year type of shoe. Okay, that's when it's going to have to be dealt with. But the provinces aren't going to forget about more healthcare money, and the federal government, I think, is going to use that to lever something on the long-term healthcare side.
Jim, maybe I'd turn the question back to you, frankly, and that is, not really much for long-term care and not really much for pharmacare. And two very interesting areas that the government chose not to act. I mean, is this simply because that's not an accessible block of voters to this government, or is there some other less tactical political reason that is driving these decisions?
Yeah, on that, Paul, I don't have a good sense. I've always thought of them as similar policy areas, which is when you're either caring for young kids or caring for an elderly parent, it takes over your life. And so you care about it a lot, but you can't mobilize politically. And then once you're out the other side of that caregiving, people seem to have amnesia. And so you don't see the types of mobilization around these issues that you do in other sectors. And from the political side, that's why I find the choice so interesting, is because you have clear crises in both. I think they're kind of analogous policy areas. And the feds chose one, I think, pretty clearly. And yeah, I haven't seen kind of more detailed polling on it, but I think the politics of it's a really, really interesting calculation. I've got a kind of fun request from Alistair, and so I'm going to throw it up here while we still have time to do it. And what he's asking for is kind of a lightning round. So we started off by talking about the risk, the financial risks 10 years out of continuing to borrow. But if you were doing a kind of full-blown risk assessment of the federal and provincial situations, and you had to pick your top 3 risks to account for in budgeting, what would they be? And did we account for them in either document? So I think I will just let whoever comes up with the top 3 first grab the mic and put those on the table.
Top 3 risks. Well, I mean, I'll throw out my 3, and then we'll see if the 4 of us are on the same page or not. Okay. You know, the biggest risk for budgets, provincially or federally, is always elections. And that's a real risk at the federal level, and at the provincial level, you know, it's only a couple of years off, and 3 years off, I guess, now. And as Paul said, they're always preparing for one. So that's one of them from my perspective. The second one is interest rates. There's a lot of people that believe interest rates aren't going up. I'm not one of them. I believe they're going to go up. To me, it's just a question of how much, and it may not be a lot. You know, maybe you're talking, you know, 2 or 3 percentage points over the next 6, 7 years. But when you look at what we were obtaining debt for, and just 2 or 3 percentage point increase, and Paul accentuated this, okay, that's a major increase in interest costs. And so I think long-term, that is a real issue for us. I do. And you want to remember, when we got our deficit under control and, you know, we started spinning off surpluses provincially and federally, okay, a large part of that was because of interest rates going down. When I was at the Department of Finance, you know, we had debt out there at 10, 11%, 12%, and that was being swapped out for debt at 3 and 4 and 5%, down in that range. And so that's a big, big change it is. You know, so that's a second one from my perspective that's pretty significant. And the sleeper that is bothering me right now is the change in the foreign exchange rate with the United States. You know, it's gone up roughly 10% in a year. You know, people are still saying right now it's going to sort of level off at 80. I'm wondering, you know, the US right now is, if we think we have fiscal problems from a government perspective, the US has them in spades. And I keep wondering, you know, they're spending a lot of money. Sort of, where is that going to take us, and what's that going to do to world markets? And again, what might it do in terms of the value of the greenback down there? So those are kind of 3 from my perspective, Jim.
I only have one, and that's COVID. When provincial governments budgeted this time last year, they had to throw it all out because of COVID, and we don't know what the world is going to look like a year from now and the next budget. And so I think that's a big issue. And you know, related to COVID is just vaccination rates. Will vaccine hesitancy in the US mean that they don't reach full herd immunity, and that slows down the US economy? And what effect will that have on Canada, sort of dragging us, even if we reach that key level of vaccination for adults across the country? I think that the biggest uncertainty and risk is still just COVID.
Yeah, I think it's just given that, like, it's hard to come back with a top 3, but I think for me, cost of borrowing for me is really one of those key risks to talk about and make sure you get some plans around. The revenue sources going forward that I think we've already talked about, and trying to get our head around what are governments prepared to actually start to do to get out of deficit and debt financing for all of these things that are important. And the third comes back to Jennifer, the impact of the pandemic. And I really think it's about prioritizing those learnings and putting some plans in place in terms of addressing things like long-term care, the education system, and I think job creation and training, because I really think we've got to get to a place of understanding what the future workforce needs to look like in terms of really driving the economy and less reliance on what has traditionally been the priorities in Canada, and what does that future look like. And I think that's where everyone needs to start spending some more time thinking about that and getting to drawing some conclusions on it.
Maybe I could focus on a longer term effect that's related pretty closely to what Claire just said. You know, when I look at the budget, one of the things that I think is one of the biggest risks going forward for Canada as a whole is slowing rate of economic growth. You know, it used to be that you know, we would have average growth rates of 2 or 3% real GDP. And but for the past 20 years, it's been between 1 and 2. And, you know, even the optimistic federal budget has it, you know, once we get back to kind of 5 years from now, steady state, you know, in the 1.5 to 1.7% growth rate. Well, we're talking about bringing in 400,000 people a year in terms of immigration. So in terms of economic growth per person, it's starting to get, you know, minuscule. And why that is important is that, you know, that is how we improve living standards. That's how we reduce poverty. Those are the kinds of things that are absolutely essential to reaching our societal goals. I don't see, you know, I see a lot of, well, we're going to have this fund for you know, artificial intelligence and technology and all that. But I think that really the fundamentals of this are better education, better skills for our workers, and that has to start right at you know, with our kids, and that's why childcare, I think, is an important part of this. But also federal and provincial governments making investments for K-12 and post-secondary, and not just universities, also and especially colleges, and also focusing on parts of society where we're not doing so well there. You know, and there are some, I mean, First Nations are areas where there's lots of opportunity to improve. So, you know, I think that one of our big risks is slowing growth, and we really have to turn our minds to things that we can do as a society to get that growth going again, so that we can have the, you know, the prosperity in order to reach our societal goals.
It's neat. It's an interesting set of risks. Haijen asks me a question, which I'm going to frame a little bit as a follow-on to your risk assessments. And that's, you know, remember that we are a policy school, and so we've got a lot of students on the call. And thinking about, you know, one of the reasons that federal budget is so long is there's a couple of hundred pages of gender-based analysis plus in the middle of it, kind of a new way of evaluating stuff. What's the skill set in looking at these risks and thinking about the budgeting environment that junior people ought to be working on developing? And is it different than what Ron would have come out of with a master's in public finance 30 years ago? So what should our students be paying attention to, thinking of these two budgets as future public servants?
Well, and I'll kick it off again, Jim, okay? But I think there's two things that to me is apparent, okay? One's not quite along the line that you're phrasing this, okay? But, you know, one is that public policy is still evident, okay, when you look at the two budgets. A lot of the initiatives are there, okay? You're very dependent on what you're taught at university, okay? On the types of theories and analysis, okay, that's been there for a considerable period of time. And sometimes that's refreshing. Every once in a while, you know, you look at a budget and you say, look, there's no public policy inherent in that particular budget. And I like to think in both of these, there's a fair bit of it this time. Again, whether you agree with the public policy, that's always the debate, et cetera, okay? But you know, the part that is new is the type of detailed microanalysis now that is necessary or is expected when these public policies are being examined. And that wasn't the case 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And not just gender analysis, okay, but you know, analysis about minorities in our country, things like that. And so that is becoming more and more important to understand, you know, how to carry out that kind of analysis, how to look at the breakdowns, the sort of the evidence that's behind what's going on, and to understand some of the differences. Historically, we tended to look at our population is almost completely homogeneous, and that is it's just not the case, okay? And again, I mentioned two areas, but you know, there's always been the traditional urban rural examination of things as well, and that's becoming more and more important because rural Saskatchewan or rural Canada is not what it was 20 years ago. You know, it's more corporate based. It's you know, it's definitely a lot more affluent than it was at one point in time. So, you know, I think an understanding of microanalysis now is just, it's become more and more important to every budget and to the response to the budgets as well.
I think another thing to think about is how do you move from idea to action? And so it can't just be at a theoretical level, but how do you get to be more practical and pragmatic? So what's that level of analysis for implementation? How do you prioritize, and how do you understand what those operational implications are too, rather than just from a policy perspective?
What I can offer is frustratingly vague in that I want to say critical thinking skills are really important. And by that, I mean, any policy choice has winners and losers and has explicit trade-offs. And so critical thinking skills are incredibly important at in the public service, at the political level, for identifying those trade-offs and you know, and even trying to figure out other pieces of policy to mitigate the impacts on the losers.
I guess the other thing I would add is that I think it's important for people to look at the evidence and in particular the evidence for, you know, the jurisdiction in question. I mean, for example, you know, one of the big discussions right now, I think, is the whole issue of inequality, income inequality. If we look at the evidence, if we look at Gini coefficients in the US, where this discussion is probably most vociferous, you know, inequality has increased a great deal. But if you look at Canadian evidence, inequality has been, you know, relatively constant for the past 20 years. Doesn't mean we shouldn't address inequality, but I think that we can't just, you know, import policy debates from other jurisdictions without looking at our own evidence. And I think when we go back to what Ron said, you know, the sort of old assumptions that we make about the Canadian population and the Canadian economy probably aren't relevant anymore. And also what Jennifer said, and that is, for every policy that has winners, there's losers. And to make things work politically, you have to find some balance or some compromise that will allow a policy that is, you know, on average good or in general good to go forward. I think those are very good points for students to keep in mind.
You know, Jim, just to finish this topic off, just before the pandemic, I was out with two gray-haired individuals, as gray as me and maybe less hair than me as well, but out with them for a drink. And so, again, the pandemic wasn't in full swing yet. We really didn't understand the implications to it, et cetera. And we got chatting a little bit about public policy and sort of where public policy was at. And there was a great lament from one of those individuals, okay, about the fact that there's no large public policy debates left in this world. the days of Medicare and intergovernmental affairs and repatriating the Constitution are behind us. And we're just kind of in this sort of steady state where, there's sort of micro debates on various small things. Well, I think it's fair to say for all the students that might be on this call, that's not where we are today as a result of the pandemic, okay? It seems to me everything and anything is now back on the table. People are looking to do things differently. It's a much more interventionist period of time than we probably had in the past. And again, that's great for students. Lots of public policy discussion.
That's a cheery note and a difficult set of topics off on. Although there's lots of good questions left in the chat, I know that we're right at 12 and people have things to get to. And frankly, I'm a little bit worried about the noises my kids are making in the kitchen. So quickly, thanks to each of the panelists and thanks for the wonderful questions from the audience.